This is lecture 30 for Ancient and Medieval Worlds. This one is on the Power of Monarchs. So this lecture is really about, in its three parts, about law and order and politics. And there are going to be some narratives here in terms of politics, but the focus is not on the course of events so much as what it means for the changes in political and legal order of the Middle Ages. We're concerned here with questions of authority and legitimacy, of how kings, popes, and sultans had to work with at least the most important of their subjects in order to get what they wanted, even though they were all monarchs to one degree or another. Monarch is simply Greek for to rule alone, that is, to be at the top. The idea that a monarch, though, is all-powerful or absolute, that they can literally rule alone, is a work of early modern propaganda after the Middle Ages. It's invented by kings in the 1600s as an ideology to try and convince people that no one had the right to oppose them. This is one of my biggest pet peeves about people trying to understand the Middle Ages. You look back at medieval kings and you expect to see something like Louis XIV, the great Sun King who built Versailles in the 1600s. And that's not really how monarchy worked in the medieval period. Monarchs are human. They cannot govern a kingdom alone. They have to convince at least some of the people to help them. And no system of government, no matter how undemocratic, can function otherwise. So we're going to spend a good chunk of this lecture on the story of Magna Carta. The first two parts of this lecture will be on Magna Carta. Part one will deal with the lead up to it, what was the situation in England before the reign of John. Part two will deal with Magna Carta and the reign of John itself. And then part three will give us some counterexamples with the papacy of Innocent III and then the Mamluk sultans in the Middle East. Now, Magna Carta, part of the reason I spend so much time on this is that it's an object of fascination, still down to this day, both in Britain and here in the United States, 800 or more years later, and it's seen as a founding document of Western democracy. But the Great Charter, which is what Magna Carta means, which is what you can also see here in this title slide, is not about democracy. It is the product of feudal medieval arrangements, that is, the way liege lords and vassals interacted. So, let us remember, feudalism in England, and we're using feudalism in a very narrow sense here, in that relationship between liege lords and vassals in this particular Western European context. Feudalism in England was in some ways simpler than it was on the continent. In Capetian France, or in the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, feudal networks had evolved gradually over time since the age of Charlemagne, which was really pre-feudal in most ways. And the dynasties that were in charge there were younger than the systems they governed. They had grown up along with feudalism. But there had been, of course, a major shift in England's ruling monarchs. When William the Conqueror, that Norman Duke, the Duke of Normandy that we looked at when we talked about the Normans a few lectures ago, in 1066 won the Battle of Hastings, he wiped out the previous aristocracy to a large degree. Not everyone, but a huge amount of the existing English aristocracy was either killed at the battle or was later removed by William. And so William really got to create his feudal structure in England largely from scratch. He borrowed from Norman ideas that he brought with him from the continent, but he was able to create a much more systematic structure than one could find almost anywhere else. And certainly much stronger, which give him a great deal more centralized authority than the weak Capetian kings of France, who, as we saw, had little power outside their own personal domains. William and his heirs, and along with the Normans elsewhere, were also generally very competent administrators, a quality the Normans are sadly not often given credit for, as their military prowess overshadows it in many ways. But let us just say that the Normans, particularly William, were as aggressive with the pen as they were with the lance. William's great-grandson, to fast forward several decades, this great-grandson, Henry II, inherited not only England, but of course from William, the Duchy of Normandy, as well as from Henry's own father. He was descended by from William through his mother. Henry's father had granted him the county of Anjou, which was a strategic county in central France. Henry had inherited all of these things in his own right by the age of 18. But he also managed to marry Eleanor of Aquitaine, a famously important woman in the Middle Ages. She had recently been divorced from the King of France after they had both been in a disastrous Second Crusade we looked at last time. That was a real relationship killer, among other problems in that relationship. She was about a decade older than Henry II, and she was also the greatest heiress in France. If you look at the map on this slide, pretty much all of the lighter red in the bottom was Aquitaine. And came from Eleanor's own personal possessions. It amounted to about a third of the kingdom of France. Now, notice that means that Henry actually owned directly about half of the kingdom of France, significantly more than the actual King of France. First, Eleanor's ex-husband, Louis VII, and then his son, Philip Augustus, who we've had cause to look at with the Third Crusade, which, remember, is a little after the events I'm looking at now, and Philip is going to be the main French king that we'll be looking at later on in this lecture. But Henry II, the first king of what we often call the Plantagenet dynasty, had an empire of land stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to Scotland. And we call this today the Angevin Empire because of its connections to Anjou through his father. But no one called this at the time. It called it this at the time in part because all of this vast territory ruled by Henry II was not a single political unit. It was not like the Roman Empire, where Roman law extended everywhere in the same way. Instead, this was a variety of different polities, not necessarily even full states, because remember, that Henry is ruling in France as Duke of Normandy, or Duke of Anjou, or Duke of Normandy, or Duke of Aquitaine, or Count of Anjou, not as King of England. Actually in France, of course, technically his overlord was Philip, although he didn't pay much attention to him, as we shall see. Henry II was profoundly competent, but very temperamental and aggressive. He came to the throne of England after a long period of civil war and was determined to restore the central power of the monarchy. In order to secure his place, Henry II also made a coronation promise to govern by tradition. That was actually a very traditional promise itself, made by kings to assure their nobles that they would govern within well-established limits to their authority. But Henry was instead actually quite innovative, as many people claiming to uphold tradition actually are. Henry II sought to centralize royal control of England after these 20 years of civil war. He destroyed castles built without royal approval, for instance, during the Civil War, and he generally worked to subdue his nobles. But he didn't just do this through overt acts of military power, like these destructions of castles, but also by overhauling England's legal system. This was really Henry's brilliance, and he's often referred to as the father of English common law, that is, the common law being the system of law that the English use down to this day, and which is the basis also for the American legal system. Henry made a variety of changes that centralized royal authority and increased and refined the bureaucracy, adding to royal revenue and power at the expense of his nobles. For instance, Henry standardized forms for government documents that normalized legal procedures like how to claim your inheritance. So before this, you generally didn't even get a document to go through a lot of things we would consider to be pretty standard legal procedures, like the inheritance of a piece of land or property from one person to another. But this may seem like a real overstep on Henry's part to force everybody to use these forms, but actually he didn't force people to do this. Before, people might have asked the king to legitimate this because that would be a good legal precedent if anyone actually contested, say, who owned the land and their inheritance. But before this time, kings had only done this on an ad hoc basis when asked. Henry is now making available basically a form letter that's going to be standardized. And you can pay the king's court for one of these forms. like the forms we fill out to pay our taxes or various things like that. And so this was doubly beneficial. This was beneficial to Henry's subjects, because now they had proof of these various legal actions they had taken, and they could make use of the legal system to benefit themselves. But at the same time, it was doubly beneficial to Henry, because on the one hand, it gave him more authority. People were sort of acknowledging his authority to give out these documents, and on the other hand, it also increased his revenues, because of course Henry charged people for these forms. Henry also created traveling royal courts whose justices could overrule the local courts of his vassals, thus undermining one of the main political powers of his nobles, their manorial courts that we talked about a few lectures ago. This also increased royal revenue, as justice costs money, as anyone who's ever had to go to court, even down to this day, will know. Henry could pull all of this off because he was remarkably competent and powerful, but his nobles didn't always like it. But like many rulers we've seen, it seems Henry couldn't necessarily translate this to the next generation. In fact, Henry seems to have intended to break up his empire. It wasn't supposed to outlast him, even though and this is another sign that he didn't even think of it as an empire. Important to note is the fact that all of the centralization of government in England did not apply to Henry's other realms, especially in France, where they were each governed by their own customs, and of course where Henry technically wasn't king and couldn't necessarily make the same kind of sweeping legal reforms that he could in England. When Henry died, his huge realm in the event was not broken up among his two surviving sons, but rather it all went to the eldest, Richard the Lionheart, who, as we saw, immediately left on the Third Crusade to go fight Saladin alongside the reluctant Philip Augustus. Richard was mostly absent from England during his reign. Out of the 10 years he was King of England, he only spent 6 months in England itself. He probably never even bothered to learn English. His first language was French, as it was for most Normans. When Richard wasn't in Outremer on crusade, he spent most of his time battling Philip Augustus, the King of France, and his fellow crusader over English possessions in France like Aquitaine and Normandy. Or, of course, he was also for a while kidnapped and held for ransom. That's of course famously captured in the modern story of Robin Hood, even though Robin Hood is a myth. And of course that also required a huge increases in taxes to pay off. And Richard really utilized England as a cash cow to get revenues to go on crusade, which was enormously expensive, as I mentioned in the Crusades lecture. And then, of course, later he spent almost as much money getting himself ransomed. Now, he could only do this because of Henry's reach, the increasing power of the monarchy that Henry had made to bring in more money, because money is power. But England would put up with this because Richard, like his father Henry, was successful in war. And he was able not only to be successful in war, but to manage his kingdom. In that respect, Richard was actually in the good tradition of the Norman kings, in that he actually turns out to have been a pretty good administrator, even though he had to delegate this authority. So while both Henry and Richard rode roughshod over their nobles and their rights and demanded more and more from them in both services and money, that was grudgingly accepted because they were generally quite good at being king, or at least at doing the main thing kings were supposed to do, which was win in battle, whether that was against the King of France or in the even more prestigious crusading. And although Richard didn't retake Jerusalem, he was seen overall as a successful crusader who had saved the Holy Land from Saladin. All right, so this first part of the lecture has really set up the situation in England, how kings sort of managed to expand their power not only through military might but through bureaucracy, and how they had to be successful in order to make these overreaches of authority stick and work. In the next part of this lecture, when we talk about John, the next Plantagenet king and the younger brother of Richard, the youngest son of Henry and Eleanor, we'll see what happens when a king is far less competent and successful.